Hello, I'm Ed Needham, editor of the fabulous literary magazine Strong Words, and this is my podcast, The 5 Rules of Writing. In each episode, I speak to a most excellent writer in a particular genre about how they do it. And if you'd like to know more about Strong Words, and specifically how to subscribe, go to www.strong-words.co.uk and you'll be whisked straight to the website. Hello and welcome to the 5 Rules of Writing, brought to you by Strong Words magazine. This is a podcast where I talk to writers about the 5 things they know to be true in writing whatever it is that they write for a living. So whether they spend their days writing biographies of great Shakespearean actors or speeches for civil servants, there are some aspects of their work that are absolutely non-negotiable. Now, today my guest is the author of a magnificent work of childhood autobiography called Broken Greek. He arrived in England as a small child, the offspring of Greek Cypriot parents who fully expected to be returning permanently to their Mediterranean paradise just as soon as their Birmingham fish and chip shop provided the anticipated fortune. When that didn't happen, our author found himself with something of a primary school age identity crisis. He was Greek Cypriot indoors, English outdoors, and his initial response to that impasse was a logical one. He stopped speaking entirely for a couple of years, but eventually found another great cultural wellspring to provide him with his own sense of identity, the music of the top 40. I'd like to welcome journalist, broadcaster, and supremely entertaining autobiographer of growing up Greek in the West Midlands, Pete Paphides. Pete, welcome.
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And what a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Now, normally when people approach their autobiography, the childhood tends to be the least of it. You know, some people can barely summon a couple of paragraphs when writing about their childhood. What made you realise there was an entire book in it for you?
That always surprises me, actually. It surprises me when people kind of skip the first few years, because I think that, 80% of what we are is, I think, sort of pretty much created in the first 10 years of our lives. And I think, in the sphere of psychology, I think that's becoming more and more of an inarguable point. They're hugely important, those first few years. And I just think that those are just the years in which you're being made. And they're really interesting. It's just a really interesting time because one reason why I think it's interesting is because of, you know very little, so the conclusions you come to are often way off beam, but kind of interesting in their own right. And so I really wanted to, I remembered a lot. I just seem to remember a lot about how I felt in those first sort of 10, 15 years of my life. I remember the confusion of just trying to figure stuff out, because certainly growing up, I'm 51, and sort of having spent the first years of my life in the 70s, when everyone's parents were very busy, and dishwashers hadn't been invented, and my mum didn't even have a sort of a washing machine till 1979 or something. And they worked in a fish and chip shop full time. So parents aren't really going to have to explain that much to you. So you draw a lot of false conclusions, and you're just to figure out human relationships. You're getting things wrong a lot of the time. I think it's really interesting the ways in which we get things wrong. And trial and you get to adulthood by process of trial and error. That, I think, that's absolutely true of all of us. It has to be. And what isn't interesting about that? I mean, I think it's interesting. My job was to make it as interesting for other people as I found it.
Brilliant. Now, one of the things that virtually all writers have in common is that, hardly any of them actually enjoy writing. Did you enjoy writing this?
I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I mean, I traditionally enjoyed writing a huge amount. But there were ways in which I thought I could probably this more enjoyable, and one was to not show it to anyone, to just sort of not put myself under pressure of deadlines, and so the downside of that was I felt very guilty. I felt like what I was doing might end up being an enormous waste of time. And so my preferred environment in which to write, I like to leave the house. I like to be in cafes. I like to have the kind of white noise of human traffic.
You like a bit of distraction.
Around. Yeah, except I don't find it distracting. I think it's kind of the opposite of distraction. It just puts me in a kind of neutral space. It's quite comforting. I like being around people going about their business. But the downside of that is I'd sort of come home and, my wife, who is a sort of a genuinely successful writer, is is hugely productive. So I'd come home at the end of each day and I didn't even know if what I was writing was even a book. And the only reason I could even allow myself the space to do it was because one of us was earning money and it wasn't me. So, it was very nice of her to allow me that time and space and not to make me feel guilty about doing it. It did make it more enjoyable. To answer your question, it did make it more enjoyable because if today had just been a complete write-off, it didn't really, I wasn't disappointing any editors. But yeah, writing, I mean, by trade, I'm a music journalist. And like a lot of people who do what I do, I press send when I can't make it any better than it is. But that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's any good. I've just run out of ways in which to not make it totally rubbish. And so, and of course, the thing with writing is, it's like, you're assembling hopefully a piece that will read smoothly from beginning to end, and people won't be able to see the joins. People won't be able to see the sort of stitch work. But you won't really know that until hopefully a reader or an editor, someone gets in touch with you and says, I really liked that piece. And then you allow yourself to read it back and hopefully read it as that person will have read it. And that's when you start to get a sense of whether or not it was actually any good as a piece of writing.
Sure. And just in terms of output, there seems to be, among writers who I've spoken to, almost unwritten rule that must be made that correct number of words to write each day is 500. Did you obey that?
I really hope it is 500 because that sort of slightly, sometimes it was more, sometimes it was less. But I think about... I would aim for, like anything between 800 and 1500 was enough to not make me feel terrible about what I'd done. So that makes me feel quite good.
From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing. Good. Now we're going to get onto your rules of writing, and I also have to extend my gratitude to you because although this is clearly titled The 5 Rules of Writing, you've decided that 5 is an inadequate number to fully inform potential writers of childhood autobiography of just what lies ahead for them. So you've very generously supplied 7. Is that because it's a particularly tricky genre to write in?
I very sloppily supplied 7. And actually, part of the thing was that like you could just like edit out the 2 most rubbish ones. But now you've actually said it out loud. You've made it difficult for yourself, unless you pop up at the end and say, actually, Pete was right. 2 of them were a bit rubbish. So it was 5.
I consider it a bonus. So let's go. The first one, you say, if you can see the whole thing ahead of you, write it before you pitch it. How does this work?
Yeah, and that sort of follows on from what I was saying in a way about sort of taking the pressure off myself. Well, certainly, I'm the worst pitcher in the world. I pitch ideas, and I feel the confidence drain out of me as I'm pitching the idea, and I just see the look of consternation on the faces of the people I'm pitching to, as if to say, "What you actually arranged a meeting with me a very busy person and a very important person, in order to sell me this terrible idea." And I think Broken Greek, in terms of doing things properly, I think it's a pretty terrible idea as well, because it in one sense it can't decide if it's a music book or if it's a memoir, and really it's kind of and the reason it can't decide whether or not it's one or the other is because I couldn't really tell the story, the memoir bit, without talking about the music bit, because music was such an absolute total overwhelming presence in my life. Music was the engine by which I sort of came to understand what was happening to me in the non-musical area of my life. So I just could not separate these two things. And so it was important to keep those two things together. I also sort of think that the way we write about music, has been a certain way. The kind of the sort of artifice or the appearance of objectivity when people historically have reviewed records for music papers. I'm not sure that's sort of so viable anymore, because you're not necessarily trying to describe records for people who only have a certain amount of money and want to make sure they make the right decision, because there are streaming services now which allow you to hear records before you buy them. So I think music writing can't really do the same job it did before. Mm-hmm. And I think one way for music writing to sort of survive or adapt to a new this new era is to be a bit more personal, and not to be like the impartial voice in the sky telling you exactly sort of whether or not you were allowed to like this record. Right. And so that was another sort of purpose of the book. So I wrote the whole thing because that way I didn't have to pitch it, basically.
Okay. So when you said pitching it, you're pitching it to agents, presumably. And no, I just wondered what it was about your pitch that finally made the penny drop on the other side.
I wrote a putative chapter, which ironically ended up not appearing in the book because it fell outside of the time frame I decided eventually that the book needed to be in, which is handy, because if I write a sequel, I've got a chapter in the back. So I got an agent on the back of that chapter, and then but then I both my agent and I decided that we should that if there was no hurry, really, if I wasn't sort of desperate to get an advance, then I should just sort of write the first maybe 7 or 8 chapters and then maybe look at getting in advance. But by that time I sort of decided that I could see the pitfalls ahead, because it was obviously going to be a very long book, and I had no earthly reason to believe that sort of a relatively unknown author like me could ever have the sway to have a book like this, a memoir that finishes at the age of 13 and a half. And it's 582 pages long. I mean, who in their right mind would? So that was the other thing. I thought, well, I think it does need to be this length, because I think that kind of immersive level of detail, that's I wanted people to have this kind of 360-degree sense that they really were sort of almost experiencing, almost in real time, as it were, what was this kind of the glacial way in which you sort of grow up. And yes, it had to be long. It had to be long in order to do that. But of course, it's one thing to pitch that idea, but no one's going to let it. So I thought, well, rather than explain why it's important that has to happen, again, that's another good thing about writing it in its entirety. Then I don't have to explain.
Well, that kind of comes on to the second rule, because it is, you mentioned it's a long book, and it's you haven't even made your 14th birthday by the end of it, but it's actually a very easy read. This isn't a steep mountain. It's a very pleasurable experience to read. And so your second rule, you say, the reader is a guest in your interior world. Ensure they don't need to lift a finger. Be the private detective of your past. So how did you pull off this trick that the reader feels they don't need to lift a finger?
By pretending to be the reader, in a way, by sort of putting myself in the reader's place, reading what I'd done out loud, and just having a sense that I always wanted the writing to be like. Have you seen the video to "Free as a Bird"? The Beatles, the song that the Beatles recorded around the time of Anthology. It's from the perspective of of a bird just swooping in to particular kind of scenarios that are described in different Beatles songs, and you sort of or the sense of a camera just moving from one room to another in a quite an unhurried way, so you sort of get the sense of everything that's sort of happening in the room. And so when I was, especially I thought it was very important to do that in the early part of the book, to really absolutely make people be able to see in their mind's eye where everything was, so they could be, you know, that kind of child's eye view of the world was, you know, they had that child's eye view of the world. And so I just took my time. I felt like descriptions that are not always strictly relevant to the narrative needed to be sort of unhurried, and you know, so you had this sense of just. There's a bit in the book where I sort of describe our next door neighbor. We moved to a house in 1979 where we had neighbors that were very British. You know, there were kind of a real range of very British archetypes, and so I really needed to make sure that I guess just read my descriptions, really, that you knew what those archetypes were. So there was a very kind of uptight British couple, probably in their 60s around that time, that were very sort of, like I said, very uptight, emotionally sort of constipated, as it were. And, you know, that very classic sort of, you know, that scenario described very well by Ray Davies in the song Shangri-La. This, you know, the Englishman's home is his castle. And so when I talk about being the private detective of your past, one of the first things I did when I started writing the book is I interviewed people who were able to allow me to be the private detective of my past. So I interviewed our next door neighbor on the other side, with whom we'd stayed in touch. A very lovely woman called Joyce, who has since passed away, sadly. And she was the mother of the kind of surrogate big sister character that lived next door to me, Jed. And anyway, she was fantastic in describing the kind of eccentricities of this very uptight couple that lived on the other side of us. And she gave me this wonderful detail of Dennis. He was called Dennis, planting tulips in his garden and having a tape measure to make sure that all the tulips were equidistant with each other, and when they came up, they were like sort of soldiers on parade. And that, I think that was a phrase Joyce even used, which I sort of half-inched for the book. And so all these things I had to do to sort of make sure that people really did get a very sort of vivid sense of this world. You have to interview people. I met an old school teacher of mine who was my teacher in the second year of infant school, and she was fantastic. She was so she gave me lots of details, and you wouldn't know, it's like you wouldn't read the book and think, oh, he's interviewed that person, you know. I just sort of described what she told me. So
what were you shocked to discover about yourself from this teacher?
That's a good question. I was shocked that she remembered me as vividly as she did, and of course she would have remembered me because I was the weird silent kid that wouldn't speak to anyone. I think so. She'd felt quite protective of me, but again, she really painted this fantastic picture of what it was like to be an infant school teacher in the 1970s, before that whole profession was overly regulated. So she talked about kind of, you know, she was in her second year of teaching, so she was in her 20s, and she would go to the pub at lunchtime with another teacher, Miss Zimnovodsky, who taught in the classroom right next to our classroom. They'd go, and there was a hamster there was like a pet hamster in that class, which she would release from its cage and put in her coat pocket, and they take the hamster down to the pub at lunchtime and have half a pint of beer each, and she'd give the hamster a little bit of a cheese sandwich. And you know, details like that are just kind of heavenly to anyone writing a book like this, because It immediately kind of evokes a very different sort of, a time that's so different to the one we have now.
Yeah, primary schools were completely different places, weren't they? I remember when I was at primary school, we had there was a guillotine, which was just a sort of wooden chopping block with a big knife attached with a hinge, for chopping paper. And some poor kid managed to take a couple of fingers off. And all that happened was that I think they announced in assembly, if you're using the guillotine, you've got to be a bit more careful with it. And that was that was it. Carry on. It was.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's that sort of that everything was just dealt with so much more casually, and so that was amazing. And it was really nice to have confirmed, things that I thought that I remembered so vividly that I thought I've just kind of unconsciously embellished them as time has gone by. So this teacher, who I'd remembered as just being like very, very sort of thin in the way that people were in the 70s. I mean, there was a kind of level of thinness that was just default in the 70s. And I said she had her body was a bit like one of those kind of fruit bars that you give to small children, which was just like flat all the way down. But she had this fantastic afro. She had this like bubble perm, I guess, but it was really big, like it was a big bubble perm. And she had these huge kind of glasses. So the combination of her sort of flat kind of body with her flared trousers, high-waisted flared trousers, which accentuated it, and her curly hair and her big glass just made her look like she'd stepped out of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
Yes. And I'm seeing a nylon paisley top of some sort.
Yes. And I said, I said to Miss Haler, she's called Chris Waters, she's since got married. She's now she's just retired. She's in her 60s now. I said, did Miss Simnevodsky really look like that? And she said, yes, that's exactly what she looked like. So that was really pleasing, and things like, and again, what I mean about be the private detective of your, a lot of it is a little bit like detective work. And sometimes things fall into place as a result of that, quite serendipitously, that you just would have had no reason to thought that they would fall into place. So there's a story I tell in the book about how around one morning at school, someone had dumped several boxes of stickers from a local filter. They weren't nice stickers like stickers that people buy for their children. They were just they had the logo of this filter, like a car filters, I think, they were called Harmo, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of stickers just all around the school, and people were just sticking them on each other and so forth. And this was emblematic of a time when there was just generally less stuff. And if you just found anything that was remotely useful or anything that would break the boredom, you would take it. And so anyway, when I was researching, there was a rather sort of dark episode in the history of my school when a boy in my year had killed a much younger boy on a piece of sort of wasteland, sort of scrubland, just just very near to where the site of our school was. And I had to make sure, obviously, I got my facts straight. And so I went to a Birmingham Central Library and got, they still had all the old newspapers on microfiche. So I was looking through the microfiches, and I found the local newspaper stories about that. And it was one thing. And in his testimony to the police, the boy that had killed this other boy said that they'd gone to this piece of wasteland to look for more stickers, more of these stickers. So it's just weird to sort of this story that I'd remember, because I still got an exercise book which is emblazoned with all of these stickers that we'd found. Mm-hmm. And it's weird to think that this boy had gone to this piece of wasteland ostensibly in search of these stickers and got into some kind of weird game that had gone wrong, which had resulted in this boy being killed. So these things these connections being made, again, made you say, oh God, I wasn't imagining that. That's, oh God, blimey. Yeah.
And that kind of leads on to your third point, because these are obviously the big sort of standout moments. But then you also say, so it's your third rule, you say, if decades later you remember an ostensibly unmemorable event, there's probably a reason for that. What prompted this rule?
Yeah, and I think this is really useful in terms of, they're often, as a child, things just stick with you, and you don't really understand why. And the great thing about being older is that you can sort of go back and kind of take it apart a bit and understand it a little bit better. And so I really wanted to not deny those kind of ostensibly unmemorable events. I just felt it was very useful to just keep asking myself why. Well, why do you remember that? And and so in building up this kind of composite sort of granular picture of the world as it seems to a child, that was very, very useful. So there's like a story about my ABBA, obviously became a huge thing in the 70s, and my dad, who wasn't really paying attention to pop, even he noticed ABBA. And I remember him having a conversation with me when my mum was in the room, and I would have been around 7, I think. And he just asked me, because he's an unreconstructed Greek Cypriot guy talking to his son. He asked me who I thought the sexiest member of ABBA was, and I remember the thing I remember was the unhappy look on my mum's face as he asked me this. And I didn't really know what sexy. I knew that it was a thing that was, it was kind of it was almost like I just thought it was another word for who's your favorite. But I knew that typically I would be expected to find a beautiful woman sexy. So in other words, if I said Benny, that wouldn't have gone down.
Heading for a clip around the ear.
Yeah. So you just think it's a set, and I knew who was the nicest person who I thought was the nicest person in ABBA, and that was Agneta. So I said, so again, I just remember my mum really not looking at all, looking a bit sad or just a bit unhappy about. So that stayed with me. Of course, you can go back now. I didn't really understand why at the time, but I can sort of go back now, and not only explain that to myself, but to sort of explain why I felt quite protective, far from finding her sort of sexy as such. I felt quite protective of Agneta. And I think that was to do with her generally melancholy kind of bearing. And later on, especially around the video to The Winner Takes It All, well, she just reminded me of my mum. She looked like this. She looked like my mum after my mum had just had a row with my dad. That's what Agneta looked like to me in the video to Winner Takes It All. And again, these things sort of stay with you. There's a program, I described watching a program called The Big Time, which was hosted by Esther Ranson. And it was a very early example of a reality TV show in which people who wanted to, someone who might maybe wanted to be a cordon bleu chef, would be sort of, they'd follow them as they attempted to sort of crack their way into that world, or a professional footballer. And this was the way the pop star Sheena Easton had one of these programs devoted to her. So they're following her around as she tried to get a record deal, and when she gets a record deal, she meets different stylists, who all of whom have opinions about how she should present herself and what kind of music she should be making. And I remember, bear in mind that this is pre-video, at this point, no one I knew had a video recorder. So this is a program I watched once in my life, and I remembered it so clearly. And again, you don't really know why, but at the time, but I sort of go back and I sort of realized that what I remembered was the sort of sense of disappointment that that this was. It didn't look like it was very much fun trying to be a pop star. In fact, it looked quite demeaning, and it looked like you would just be pushed from pillar to post, criticized in quite cruel terms often, and you're kind of broken before you even sort of have a record out. And I just sort of. And this kind of contributed to this, which is as you know, is a recurring theme in the book, which is this sort of sense that there just seemed to be no version of adulthood that wasn't disappointing compared to childhood. You're constantly being told about nuclear war or the Cold War, or having no job prospects later on when the unemployment started to rise. There just seemed to be no one was really offering you a version of adulthood that was actually as good as you kind of wanted it to be. So awkward moments, were memorable. Things where life was not as it seemed to be on the box, which is again another reason why this essentially a story in which nothing much happens. Like the first time we tried pot noodle. We'd seen the adverts and it looked like the most exciting. It looked like space food, and my brother and I were really excited about kind of getting some pot noodle, and we got sort of like we brought some back to the house where we sort of basically almost hoodwinked our dad into sort of buying us a pot noodle when we went out to get his Sunday paper, and we sort of prepared it at the same time as this Sunday lunch that my mum had been preparing for ages. And again, I just remember this sort of this desultory sort of kind of cultural collision between like the wonderful Sunday lunch my mum had been sort of preparing and the fact that we were more excited about sharing a pot noodle than and of course it's only looking back that you sort of think, okay, that's why I remember it, because it was awkward. You remember awkward things.
Right. Well, I mean, also, I think, most people remember the absolute crushing disappointment of the first encounter with the pot noodle. But given the scale of the advertising behind it and glamour that it seemed to appear to radiate on the television. But one of the great things about your book is that it is genuinely funny. It is a really funny read. And so your first rule, you say, try and make it funny, and you succeed in that. It's harder for people to object to something if they're laughing. Now, it's a really likable and entertaining story. How did you, what did you do to deliberately make it so, or is that just how it kind of rolled out?
Well, I left out a lot of stuff that wasn't funny, and I just sort of the stories you naturally err towards telling are the ones where, again, I'm really interested in situations where life just falls short of how it's kind of looks on the box, as it were, and so a lot of the humor I like now kind of revolves around that. I'm really delighted that I somehow managed to get my kids into Seinfeld when they were young, because again, that kind of those moments where things just go slightly wrong. And I think as a child, it happens a lot in life. I think because I think one thing that I realized when I was writing the book is actually I didn't realize how much of the time I spent feeling sort of guilty about the fact that I was turning into something that was different to what my kind of parents thought. I was becoming British. I was becoming British. And my parents wanted me to be Greek. And even though they were kind of sort of not really saying that explicitly, it was kind of obvious. So a lot of the funny stuff that happens in the book is really me trying to sort of figure out, trying to shuttle between these, trying to understand British culture as it's presented to me outside the four walls of my house. And so, there are things like, because let me think. So for instance, there's a section in the book. So we had these wonderful next door neighbors. I mentioned Joyce earlier on, who's no longer with us, and the girl that lived next door is called Jed, who I'm still friends with, and she's still 4 years older than me, and she. And they were just such a fantastic family to live next door to, because they were real they were very, unlike the Tulips guy who I mentioned earlier on, Dennis. They were a lot more relaxed. They were kind of very post-war, more of an arts and craftsy, self-improving, very much kind of product of the welfare state, cultured, but not necessarily aspiring to be middle class. They just were what they were, and a classic thing about, they had a piano in their sitting room, but they also had a very small black and white TV, and that seemed to be sort of the kind of downscaling of the television in comparison to the piano told you a lot about them, as indeed did the fact that they had wooden floors. Now, to my mum, who had come from Greece and was really wanted to be middle class, that was the whole, that was the big aspiration. She wanted to have net curtains and, matching furniture.
Mm-hmm.
And it was unthinkable to her that why did they not have carpets? Why did they have wooden floors with just the occasional rug on them? And why did they have this saucepan? That this pan, it was more of a large frying pan that they never washed, because of course, I understand why people have that thing of having a pan that you never wash, because it's sort of you're seasoning it, or you don't scrub it too hard, that kind of. So, and that's and the wooden floor thing just mystified her, because why wouldn't you? It's like, could they not afford a cup? It was like a decision that they'd made anyway. So I would be intrigued by them as well. And there's a lot of naturally kind of that whole. So I remember one afternoon, I walked outside the house. We lived in a little kind of cul-de-sac. I walked to the end of the road, and Jed, which was short for Geraldine, the girl that was 4 years older than me, was standing there outside the bus stop, the number 11 bus stop, with a clipboard and a petition. And I said, what are you doing? She said, she called me Takis, because Takis was the name my parents called me, my Greek name. Mm-hmm. She said, I'm collecting signatures to save Moseley Bog. And I said, Moseley what? It's a bar. It's this really beautiful bog in Moseley. That's Moseley was 2 miles down the road. That's kind of a habitat for natural wild. I just thought it was hilarious. She was trying to bog to me meant toilet. I'm going to the bog, and the fact that she was just. It seemed to me just a transgressive act to even be standing there accosting strangers, asking for their signatures. It seemed to be like a kind of thing that mad people did,
Yes. Well, that takes it very much onto the next one, where you say, remember how inexplicable most of the world is to children. You say, and this is a very Zen-like observation. You say, imagination is the empty construction site of all the knowledge you will spend the rest of your life building.
Well, yeah, so it's slightly lofty. I couldn't really think of another way to put it. But I mean, again, and that in a way, you're right. That follows on from this try and make it funny thing. So the kind of what your imagination does, the sort of placeholder beliefs that you put in there, which will in time be replaced by facts, are often more kind of interesting or more revealing than the facts that will ultimately replace them. So there's a section, one of the first pop songs I really fell in love with and was very intrigued by was Roxanne by The Police. Mm-hmm. And that, it was really the beginning of my adoration of Sting, who, of course, Sting, it's not particularly cool now to say that you adore Sting, but as a sort of, as a 9 going on 10-year-old who, was looking for sort of, older brother / father figure kind of role models who kind of might sort of almost look after me or kind of see me right, So Sting was a very credible in that role to me, And so when the Police released Roxanne, well, all the things I didn't really understand about it, I sort of kind of pieced together myself. So I asked my brother Aki, who's 4 years older than me, what was this business about the red light? Why doesn't he want her to put on the red light? And he said, well, that's because she's a prostitute. And I said, well, what's a prostitute? And so he kind of wearily explained to me what you do when you're a prostitute. I didn't understand, but there's so much I didn't understand. The red light thing. Why does it have to be? Why is that a thing? And of course it was. You conflate things. That's the other thing, as you do when you're a child. You conflate things because you're trying to understand the world. So the Yorkshire Ripper was at large. Yorkshire Ripper. Yeah, Peter Sutcliffe was at large. And Peter Sutcliffe was at large doing the unspeakable things that he did. And the police investigation, as we know now, erroneously, and betraying its own institutionalized misogyny, thought that he was trying to kill prostitutes. So he was trying to, quote unquote, punish prostitutes for their sinful behavior. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be the subtext of the police investigation. And so I thought, well, police. So Sting is in a band called the Police. So it's almost like he's a special policeman who goes in to sort of save prostitutes and maybe try and persuade them to do a safer job. That was kind of what. So I adored him, just for that, if nothing else. And then the ensuing releases by his band sort of fed into this perception, so that when he put out by the time he put out Message in a Bowl, I had a teacher at school who I really didn't like. He didn't like me. He was very sporty. I wasn't. And so I used to fantasize about Sting just coming in, like Sting, because I think I'd read that he used to be a teacher. So I love the idea that maybe Sting might be, be like the dreamy supply teacher who would sort of come in and give us a music lesson. And, of course,
he didn't.
He didn't, but I'd be the one who'd put my hand in my fantasy. I'd put my hand up when he asked us who he was, because I knew who he was. And then he'd be like, "Hey kid, you're pretty good. You know your music."
And also an incredibly, advanced, if erroneous, subtext to the output of the Police at the time. I think most people were just quite happy to tap their feet, weren't they, and clap their hands.
Yeah, but I think, that's the great thing about being a child. You will just, you construct these entire narratives, and all you have to do, in my position, is just try and sort of remember them, or at least not sort of think that they're stupid, because this kind of goes on to my next point, really, because I don't think any thought that a child has is a stupid one. They're just trying to figure out their place in the world.
So moving on, we've heard your Zen-like observation. This next point is more of a manifesto. So I'm just going to read it out. You say, because you couldn't articulate it to yourself at the time, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Your adult vocabulary is there to express emotions you couldn't articulate. Your job, you couldn't articulate at the time. Your job is to accord the passions of children the same respect we accord to the passions of adults, to use your adult vocabulary, to explain those passions on behalf of the child who didn't have the tools to do so.
Sorry, again, that sounds a little bit lofty, but it's really what I'm trying to sort of get across there is that I think I was thinking about this kind of notion of, people call them guilty pleasures now, and sort of this idea that of liking things that are now regarded as sort of critically irredeemable. And I sort of think that there's a reason, you are, as a child, you're at your most honest, before notions of cool come into play, before these kind of games that you play with yourself, before you're trying to steer yourself in a certain direction to become a certain kind of person. There's this just fantastic period early on in life where you like what you like, and you might not, and that's what I mean by not articulate. You might not necessarily be able to articulate it to yourself at the time, but the great thing about the position the job I gave myself was that, well, I have a memory, and if you have a memory of something, you can figure out why you felt that particular feeling. And so with reference to music in particular, I thought that was quite important. So there's a couple of things that spring to mind, a couple of songs that spring to mind that I write about. And there's this kind of epiphany I sort of describe when I hear a song by the Rubettes called Sugar Baby Love, which people of a certain age will certainly know the song. And it really is, it's not actually a gentleman called Mark Ellen who used to edit Smash Hits, and Q, and is just a great character in the history of music publishing. And he read an early copy of the book, and he said, you need to get a copy of, you need to get this to one of the Rubettes, because no one, music journalists were not writing about the Rubettes at the time because they were so naff. They were like a sort of bubblegum sort of musical confection. They were so naff. No one was writing about them seriously at the time. And in the book, I talk about this sort of epiphany I have listening to the Rubettes at the age of 5, with this kind of ascending dramatic kind of intro to Sugar Baby Love. And, and at the time, I this is a period in my life where I was really feeling a kind of guilt, a really kind of almost an unbearable guilt, because I'd stopped talking to people, and I could see the amount of anguish and embarrassment it was causing my parents. But it was just something that I couldn't explain it to myself. I just couldn't, I just stopped talking. It was a sort of control thing. I don't know what it was even to this day entirely. And listening to Sugar Baby Love, listening to that song, this kind of complete outpouring of how anguished sort of self-recrimination. Well, of course I was going to love that, because it was a sort of, it was the outpouring that I was incapable of at that moment in time, but by God, did I sort of feel it. And of course, it's this ridiculous song, but no, no song is, it's as ridiculous or non-ridiculous as you want it to be. And again, so I wanted to, and going, and that was another song. So that's one song. Another song I write about in a sort of similar way is Save Your Kisses for Me by Brotherhood of Man. It's huge fun writing about these songs. Of course, no journalists ever write about these songs. It's like Greil Marcus did not write about Save Your Kisses. Nick Kent left it alone. So this is all fresh snowfall for me. It's actually huge fun writing about these songs and writing about my 6-year-old sort of reaction to a song like that. And what I wanted to do was, again, it's all about kind of riding to the defense of this 6-year-old who couldn't express it at the time, and hopefully by proxy other 6-year-olds as well. So I wanted to write, I had it before I even started. I was like, okay, I want to write about Save Your Kisses for Me the same way that dozens and dozens of writers have written about watching David Bowie do Starman on Top of the Pops for the first time. I want to freight it with that sense of drama, that sense of life-changing drama, so that when you're reading it on the page, you're thinking, is this a joke? Is it, what's going on? You don't quite know if there's going to be a punchline. And I love those moments. I love them in films. I love them in music, where you're not quite sure whether or not you're supposed to laugh. And so that gave me the chance to do that. So that's really what I mean.
And you do an extraordinary job of rehabilitating the Barren Nights. Nobody has ever written with such enthusiasm and intense sincerity about the Barren Nights.
Yeah, again, and it's all to do with the fact that, when you're 8 years old, as I was when I first saw the Barren Nights on Top of the Pops, you're looking for very different things at the age of 8 to the things that you're looking for when you're 18. And so when I saw these kind of self-proclaimed kind of court jesters of pop turning up on my television and doing this kind of medley of songs, which were all sort of songs that have been recent hits for other people, but with new humorous lyrics, to me, that was an act of absolute sort of insurrection. I didn't even know that you were allowed to do that. I thought you'd be put in prison if you kind of just made up silly records to other people. So my brother was just experiencing his first kind of wave of, excitement to punk. But for me, for an 8-year-old child, the Barren Nights were as punk as the Sex Pistols were to my brother. So it's just a matter of getting into that kind of headspace, that you occupied as an 8-year-old, and not writing it off, not dismissing it. So, okay, well, this is how I felt. I must have felt like this for a reason. Let's slow down and figure out what that reason was. Let's use memory to understand because we have an emotional memory. We don't have a memory for events. We have a memory for the emotions that we felt. So we can just go back there and figure it out, hopefully.
Okay, and one final point that you make is a don't use your book to settle scores. Do you say this because you learnt the hard way, or how did you come across this point?
I'm very relieved that I didn't try and write this book 10 or 20 years earlier, because I think I might have done that more. But I think maybe through the process of having sort of, raised children myself, and I just sort of think that there's something about getting older where, you end up sort of saying, the amount of times I just say, I look at something now, I look at a situation and say to myself, there, but for the grace of God, you sort of, and as children, we are, a lot of unpleasant things happened to me. I mean, not desperately, but this was never supposed to be a misery memoir, and that's the other reason why it needed to try and hopefully be funny, because it would be mortifying to me if people thought I was trying to sort of, if I thought that my experiences were comparable to those of Malala or something. Do you know what I mean? It was a confusion. I call it a confusion memoir because mostly I was confused, but some unpleasant things happened to me. I was sort of, I was bullied at times. I received a couple of beatings, and I saw, there were sort of things that happened, in my family, misunderstandings between my parents and so forth, that I think if I was younger, then I try not to be judgmental about those things, because I sort of, a couple of brief examples. First, there's a moment in the book where, my mum is seriously ill and my dad visits her in hospital, and there's a sort of, and he says a couple of quite insensitive things, shall we say, when she's lying in her hospital bed. And it was very important to me. I didn't want to miss it out because I thought it was a kind of an important insight into the nature of not just their relationship, but the way certainly Greek Cypriot and a lot of men in general were at that time. But I also didn't want to make his behavior seem sort of nasty or needlessly cruel. So at moments like that, what I realized I needed to do was just sort of try and put myself in his shoes as much as I could, factor into the equation where he grew up, the notion, how men of that generation and that sensibility were told to deal with their emotions. And it was important to do that, because in order to sort of avoid people thinking, taking sides, as it were, in that sort of, in that moment. And again, similarly, we're as kids, so the later chapters where I sort of fall in with a rough crowd and I don't really come out of it very well. It was just really important to just remember that, we're all sort of, at that age, we're all just figuring, we're all a bit scared of adulthood. We're all a bit scared of what we're going to become. We all want to fit in. And as children, you often make some pretty, you make some bad decisions about what you need to be and what you need to do in order to sort of get by. And so I really spent a lot of time, hopefully making sure that there was no, people could perceive no bitterness or score settling or in those sections of the book.
Okay, I mean that's very much. I think that's very much something you succeeded at, because it does come out as a really charming, sort of warm, sort of slightly, very innocent and sort of puzzled innocence at just what was going on around you, and it's a fabulous book, and I urge everybody to read it. It's out in paperback in June.
That's right.
Broken Greek by Pete Paphides. Pete, thank you so much for coming and
thanks so much,
sharing the background to your book. It's been hugely enjoyable listening to you.
Bless you. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. From Strong Words magazine, these are the 5 rules of writing.